So, good evening, listeners. Good morning, wherever you're joining us from. Today, we are back with our favorite team of cutting edge evaluators from the EES EvalEdge evaluation team. Today, in the studio with us, we have the podcast team along with myself, Val Gandhi. We have Tom Ling, Mariana, Alena, and Lauren. Our podcast guest for today is Petrarca Karetji, who is the head of the UN Pulse Lab Jakarta. And we are very excited to have him with us today and discuss the work that Pulse Lab Jakarta is doing and how it can be relevant for evaluators in using cutting edge and emerging tools. Briefly introducing him, Petrarca is as I said, is the head of the Pulse Lab Jakarta, part of the UN Global Pulse Network. And Pulse Lab Jakarta was established as a big data innovation lab and is now emerging as an analytic partnership accelerator for development and humanitarian action. Petra has more than 25 years of professional experience undertaking a range of international development industry roles. These include as team leader of the Knowledge Sector Initiative, senior partnerships advisor for DFAT Australia, director of poverty, decentralization, and rural development for AusAid, and director of the Eastern Indonesia Knowledge Exchange platform, also known as Bhakti. And he has been team leader for a multi-donor support office of the Eastern Indonesia within the World Bank, and prior to that as director of Austraining Nusantara. So we have a very experienced speaker who works in cutting edge tools today with us. So Pa Petra, selamat datang to our podcast, and we are very happy to have you with us today.
Terima kasih. Thank you.
Yeah, makasih Pa. So could you briefly tell us about the UN Global Pulse Network and specifically on Pulse Lab Jakarta and its mandate? Because as we know, PLJ, I've been at least viewing some of the excellent work that you do, and it's one of the few organizations that have effectively used emerging data tools, especially big data and mobile location data to support policy. So can you tell us a little bit about Pulse Lab Jakarta and its mandate, please?
Sure, and it's interesting that you should ask this because Global Pulse itself has a new emerging mandate, Val. The renewed mandate for Global Pulse, actually commencing this year, is with a focus on, as a role, to be a cross-pillar hub in the United Nations for experimentation and digital innovation, and that it's going to be integrated into the Executive Office of the Secretary General for the UN. So we'll be working closely with other strategic units. But for Pulse Lab Jakarta, we are actually looking to represent this Global Pulse's mandate on a regional level in Asia Pacific. You might not actually be aware that Pulse Lab Jakarta was established as a joint facility between the United Nations and the government of Indonesia. And we've been really fortunate to receive core funding from the government of Australia to undertake our work. Specifically at this point in time, if you're talking about our direct mandate, we're actually trying to shift from just working on data innovations towards what we specify as a role in accelerating analytic partnerships for development and humanitarian action. So what we recognized is that we were working too much in the solution space, basically developing data innovations. And we're now trying to make much more of a conscious effort to work in problem spaces where we undertake qualitative analysis and human-centered approaches. And we also work in what's called an identity space where we undertake institutional and capacity assessments. So that rounds off our approach. And what we do is try to identify key partners, work with them on problems that they are mandated to handle, and then look for viable digital solutions.
Thank you, Pa. That's quite interesting and really, really exciting to hear about it. Can you give us a couple of examples or from your current work on some of these initiatives that you're talking about? How do you use emerging data tools? Maybe some case studies, or you can point our listeners to some areas where they can check them out themselves.
Yes, I mean, definitely we try to share everything that we're doing on our website and through blogs that we publish, but just in giving you a taste of what we're doing, and I guess particularly as we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'll start with some examples that we're currently working on related to COVID-19. So one example is where we're working with the West Java province in Indonesia. West Java, yes, it's a single province, but it contains a population of 50 million people, so quite a large province. And we're working with them, particularly because they have an excellent team called the West Java Digital Service Team under the provincial government. Their mandate is with sorting and analyzing data for policymakers in the province, and particularly with the province facing high incidences of COVID-19. So we've been working with them in combining conventional data with big data sourced from social media platforms, particularly Facebook, and also with mobility data, actually sourced from Waze, which is I think now owned by Google Maps, to highlight areas with high levels of vulnerability due to a combination of variables. So we're combining variables around population density, elderly population density, pre-existing sanitation conditions, accessibility to health facilities, and level of mobility. So people moving through certain regions, and this allows the provincial government to then pinpoint the most vulnerable villages across the province facing the pandemic. And so what we helped to create was a basic visualization combining all of this data, and that's now being further developed with the provincial government, which will hopefully be used to shape policies around vaccine distribution and other control measures. If you like, just a couple of other examples. For instance, we've been working with GIZ, a German agency, and Bangkok Traffic Authority, and Grab. Grab is a major regional ride-hailing corporation, which I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, Val. So in this example, we developed a model using Grab data based on their hail riders, and we use this data to assess traffic congestion, including road speed profiling and nowcasting the traffic flow. And this helped to assess population exposure towards air pollution, which is caused due to congestion. And so it helped the authorities in developing some of the required responses. Then another example is working with the government of Vanuatu in the Pacific, and this is with just wonderful support and data access support from Digicel in the Pacific. They've been so generous in allowing us to access anonymized data from their system, and so we were allowed to look at mobile phone data, and that helped to inform on the effectiveness of the state of emergency policy issued when there was a major earthquake in Vanuatu. So we were able to use this to track the origin and destination points for evacuees, and that helped in improving the process of the relief response. So, yeah, this is just a couple of examples of what we've been doing.
Thank you so much, Bram. In terms of certain practical questions about how to use big data, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alena, who will take it from here.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Petra, for all these pertinent examples, in particular related to COVID-19. I have a different question. Big data are often large and expensive to acquire. And in recent webinars series conducted by EAS, many participants ask the question about how actually development professionals manage to have access to this data, and how do they use it? What about validity and reliability of this data? So if you can expand on this, would be very nice. Thank you.
Sure. So from our perspective, I think you need to first look at building relationships and finding common ground for collaboration with big data owners and producers, which are usually private sector. Our own approach is where we've tried to apply what's called the shared value partnerships approach. And this approach is basically looking for common interests, and where the analysis that you want to undertake does not interfere or cause a risk to commercial interests of the big data owners and producers. So another way in doing or accessing data or utilizing big data analysis is actually not in asking for full access or sharing of the data, but in creating relationship where what we look for is the data insights. So what we do is provide the algorithms that the data owners themselves then run on their data, and then what they do is provide us with the insights. So that's one way of being able to access without having to go to the full commercial costings and paying for big data. Um, I think it's a very good point, Alena, around the validity and reliability of big data. Um, my data innovations and policy team also always talks about data provenance. So Sri Ganesh is our lead in our data innovations team. He talks about data provenance, where you basically have to build a clear understanding of the nature and the limitations of the data that you're looking to access. So bearing in mind that more often than not, big data is not produced and collected with development or humanitarian action in mind. So it's definitely valid, but it's valid for its original purpose. And so the critical perspective we need to put in place is whether it holds for the new purpose that we're trying to apply this data towards, and particularly if you're talking about development or humanitarian action. So um, what we found is a good way to approach it also in being able to check the validity is first in seeking complementarity to traditional or conventional data analysis. So and but part of this data provenance is also in trying to ensure that we know what or who the data actually represents. And this also usually results in a clear perspective of who or what is discluded from the particular data set that you are accessing. So hope that answers your question, Elena.
Yes, it does. And actually, in continuation of this question, as evaluators, we always think about triangulation, and you mentioned that big data has its advantages and disadvantages. So, if you can give maybe one concrete example of how big data successfully complemented traditional data in evaluation.
Yes. Oh, definitely. One of our best examples here, also I think available on our website, was where we worked with Indonesia's National Office of Statistics. So every 5 years, the Indonesia Statistics Bureau actually implements an analysis of commuting patterns. And it's only done every 5 years because of costs and complexity, because you have to field um, a whole gang of enumerators and a host of other personnel to collect and validate the data. What we did is we used Twitter data to do the same analysis, and we were then able to show that the results were very, very close to the official survey conducted. In doing this, it convinced the Statistics Bureau that the approach could be used to complement the official survey. So not to replace, but to complement. And um, and because of the nature of the analysis, it could be undertaken at a much lower cost and also at a higher frequency to provide indications if there are shifts since the last official survey conducted, and then um, uh, and then it would be further validated in time by the next official survey to be conducted by the Bureau of Statistics. Uh, what we've done is combine conventional data that's collected by the National Bureau of Statistics on what's called village potential, which basically outlines conditions of villages across Indonesia. And we used a subset of that data, conventional data, on sanitation conditions in villages. And then we then utilize that data with other data on population density and population movement, which was sourced from big data. So I think it's seeking and showing complementarity between big data and traditional data is a great way to build confidence in big data analytics.
Thanks. That is so interesting. And there are a plethora of great examples of how big data can be used to help development professionals. I just wondered whether, or how, in your experience, you can overcome some of the resistance from development professionals and encourage them to engage with big data scientists. It may be that some of our best development professionals, their connection with big data is clicking on likes and follows. So how do you think, from your experience, we can help bridge the development sector and data science?
Oh, okay. In bridging these between data scientists and development sector, I think uh, from the development side, we really need to also have our own data science capacity that comes with the development praxis in a sense. So we need to be able to first communicate effectively, not just at a policy level or around ideals, but also at a technical level. And I guess that's where we often run into issues because we're speaking different languages, Tom. What we've done is first look at overall data ecosystem, which is relevant to the particular development or public policy issues that's to be addressed. Then we look towards providing spaces and opportunities for collaboration. So I'll give you one example of an approach that where we can bring together the different development actors and data science geeks, I guess, is what we call research dives, Tom. So this brings together data scientists, policymakers, practitioners, and academicians, and we put them together in a room, accessing data sets around a particular and looking to answer a particular policy issue, and then working collectively to try to find insights from the available data. So that's one of the ways that we've implemented to be able to bridge between the two, Tom.
Wow, thank you. That does sound very exciting. I'd love to be part of that. Speaking as an evaluator, though, this is the a kind of major focus of our work. How do you see the ways in which evaluators and data scientists can work together, maybe diversifying their methods and focusing on the big challenges of development collectively? So what is it that particularly you think you can do working with evaluators that would help us do things that we couldn't otherwise manage?
I think that both have immense value, and the results of collaborative work is so much stronger, Tom. So, for evaluators, once you get over the provenance issues and fully understand the value and characteristics of the data set that's being accessed, then there is a lot that evaluators can gain from utilizing big data, just due to the scale and the fact that the data was not influenced to highlight achievements of a particular project or intervention that's under evaluation. So, in other words, the data from big data is invaluably neutral. Again, once we understand the nature of the data and its original intent. Um, but on the other hand, for data scientists also have, and I think that's widely reported, that they have their own tendencies and biases, which can influence algorithms and the resulting insights that are produced. So in Pulse Lab Jakarta, we actually have what we call a social systems team, and that was actually established exactly for the purpose of ground truthing insights from big data analytics, particularly to understand the human element and local contexts that are impacting on the data. And again, this is why we have adopted what we call what is called the impact creation logic. This framework was actually developed by uh, a person by the name of Christian Silos and Johanna Mayer in Stanford University. And so the impact creation logic is applying this is what we're looking for is where data innovations for development, which is basically working around in the solution space, actually needs to be combined with perspectives from the problem space and also from an identity space. So we don't just develop a solution and then try to look for a problem and a host to apply that the data solution that we found. And that I think is important, where too many data innovation facilities work on a solution and then try to find how that can be applied to a particular problem and who can actually host or adopt that particular data solution.
Petra, Mariana here. I guess that
Yes.
what you're telling us is that the key here is really to understand the nature of the
Yes.
data by the evaluator. But I have a question in terms of, I mean, you mentioned a number of things you were working on. I really liked when you were talking about the complementarity between traditional data and big data. And you also outlined a few challenges already, but I wanted us to go deeper there. For example, you mentioned the work with COVID-19. You mentioned the importance of building relationships and the shared value approach. And then you talked about, with Alena, about how highly costed can be big data, but also opportunities for lowering that cost or sharing that cost with data owners. And then you mentioned the importance of communicating effectively, and also the importance of contextualizing the data locally. But can you guide us through other challenges that you've been facing when applying big data?
Yes, and thank you, Mariana, because it's definitely not straightforward. Yeah, there's so many challenges, and I think what's particular concern for us trying to use big data is that there are those who are being left behind because they don't have a digital footprint, which then would include them, of course, in big data sets. So definitely big data cannot be relied on fully to represent conditions and trends. It has to be further validated, particularly through quantitative assessments and inputs from domain experts. Also, it's not usually produced for development, right? And so more often than not, it has immense commercial value for the data owners. And a real challenge in accessing and using big data is ensuring that the competitive and commercial interests of data providers are properly considered. So, as you said, as you highlighted, that identifying those shared value propositions is so important to convince everybody that involved that opening up access and undertaking those analytical processes for development is beneficial for all sides. Another aspect I think is often, government officials and development agencies come from a high moral standpoint, seemingly, and so it's like the approach is this assumption that they should be able to access the data for humanitarian purposes, and often, in trying to access this data, and many governments and agencies don't actually have the necessary mechanisms and capacity to protect the data itself. And this creates risk for data providers. So being pertinent on your own capacity to protect and ensure the security of the data is also a challenge to be able to, in using big data for development. Then other risks, one that I find is interesting is, sometimes there is money available. Maybe there's an underspend or some project that's been that has been canceled, and so there's extra funding available, and then precedents are established where data is then purchased at full commercial value, and when there occurs these sort of precedents, it makes it difficult to progress relationships which are not based on commercial interests. If when data has already been purchased based on a commercial agreement. So These are some of the challenges, Mariana.
Some of them, I imagine, there is a full list of challenges. But let me pick up a line of yours and help us
Sure.
move from challenges to solutions. So you were talking about data providence and this idea that big data is not developed with the intent of serving development and humanitarian actions. But
Okay.
there, you mentioned a few solutions or a few ways to go about it. But can you tell us more about it? Can you tell us more about incentives and how do we build a better system where we are actually producing data that ultimately serves humanity?
It's just the nature of big data itself, where a lot of it is generated automatically, Mariana, based on digital technologies, and so it's more having the capacity to, and this is going to show my generation when I'm referring to an old film series. I don't know if you know the MacGyver series. Probably not.
I watched all of them.
Oh, okay.
I
So
know all the tricks.
exactly, and it's actually being able to approach it with an open mind and creatively look at where the data can be used and can be applied, and again also where it's not applicable. So I find it's amazing the team that I have a privilege to be engaged with, that their capacity to look at new approaches, new ways of applying data, which is not never intended for this for humanitarian or development purposes, but can be applied, of course, with various parameters uh, uh, various parameters to ensure that it's not over interpreting or creating insights that are inaccurate. And again, the value of having an evaluator team, basically a social systems team that can then ground truth those insights is just so important.
I really love the MacGyver series very much. So I think it's a new way of looking at data. I'm going to hand over to Lauren for the final few questions, and then I'll come
Sure.
back to you again.
Petra, thank you so much for this conversation so far. It's been very enlightening. Before we let you go, just a few more questions. You talked a little bit before about government capacity being lacking for storing data, but a kind of more broad question is what
Sure.
is the UN Global Pulse's role in capacity development for evaluators, particularly in terms of effective use of emerging data tools?
Oh, okay. So for this, Lauren, what we've been looking, this is where we look to apply this impact creation logic, where there's a problem space, a solution space, but also what we call what's called the identity space, basically being the capacity that's required. So um, I'm speaking in more general terms, I guess, in terms of capacity of the recipient or beneficiary organization to be able to adopt and adapt data innovation. So for Pulse Lab Jakarta, we try to undertake capacity building as part and parcel of each initiative when working in collaboration with evaluators and planners. So it's very important to first build a joint understanding of the approach and the methodologies that are applied towards each of the algorithms that then result in data insights. And so I think it's critical to always have a co-creation approach as actually being the first step towards capacity building, because the whole co-creation process actually identifies and provides insights of what are the actual capacity development requirements that are needed to and that leads to effective use of emerging data tools.
Great. And so, sort of as a follow up, then, if I'm an
Mhm.
independent evaluator or a small NGO and I want to get involved in using big data, what's a good starting point?
There's actually a lot, but I think it's really having a clear perspective on the actual issue that you're working on. And from that perspective, can big data actually be applied in the context? So definitely undertaking desk research to see if there's already been some, similar conditions where big data has been applied effectively is I feel an important starting point, Lauren. And then also in keeping an open mind about new approaches and whether existing or traditional approaches and methodologies could be approached in a more effective manner in terms of cost, time, coverage, and scale. I think that's also important. So, uh, yeah, so having an open mind and having a very clear perspective of what the actual issue is and where big data could be applied towards that issue.
Thank you so much, Petra. I think we have come to the close. I just wanted to have a brief question towards the end. Uh, Evaluators and even statisticians, for example, we rely heavily on data quality and ethics.
Mm.
How does someone who
Mm.
use big data, like informed consent, I mean, does it even apply in big data, or how do you ensure the integrity of the data sources are protected and ethics and data quality is used?
Well, that's actually the most important part of this whole approach, right? So we've actually had situations where we've been given data sets and looked at the data set and realized that it contains personal information or other confidential information, and so what we've done is basically take the hard drive back and erase it in front of the provider. Just that it's so important from our side, even if the data provider is not necessarily maintaining high standards of data protection and security and privacy, that we must ensure that cannot be bypassed. Val. So for I, I think one of the underlying questions, because everybody is so gung ho on data innovations, is something we've been working on with the Ethics Center in Australia, one of the university-based research center focusing on ethics. And the key question you have to ask yourself every time is, even if you can do it, should you do it? Just it's not we're so excited about the possibilities, we often then tend to overlook or forget about the risks, particularly towards privacy. So in all of our partnerships, we access data that's been anonymized to the extent that personal data and personal movements cannot be identified. Well,
Petra, that's actually a very good point. The idea of doing no harm when using new technologies and the different sources of data. That's a really, really good point.
Thank you, Pa. I mean, in our EvalEdge, purpose of our podcast is to also encourage a lot of young evaluators and emerging evaluators to at least familiarize themselves with what's out there, moving beyond traditional program logic and ensuring that they get exposed to big data and other emerging technologies so they can be at the forefront of guiding them. So, any final words of wisdom for evaluators or even for data scientists who might be listening in that you can leave with us
I
as a
don't know about wisdom, yeah, Val, but I think it sounds so cliche, but always remember there are real humans being represented by the figures, and that can be impacted by the algorithms, the recommendations, and conclusions, both from an evaluator side as well as data scientist side. And so, and within the people that are being represented or affected, there are those who have particular needs. They're facing incredible issues, and so just always be mindful not only of the benefits but also of the risks that emerge from our analysis. Now,
yeah, that's very true. Thank you so much again for joining us in EvalEdge Studio. That was excellent and a fruitful conversation. Dear listeners, we've just concluded another episode of exciting EvalEdge podcasts, and we hope you will continue tuning into us. And we thank you so much for listening and look forward to having you in more exciting EvalEdge and Cutting Edge podcasts. Thank you very much.